Welcome to the podcast, David. It's great to have you on. Do you mind giving us a quick rundown of your background and then also what you guys do at Avolution?
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks very much for the opportunity, Alex, and really excited to spend some time with you. I'm pretty much an enterprise software sales executive. Have spent 16 years with Microsoft and believed very firmly that a lot of innovation comes from the small end of town these days, not from the large end of town. And so made the jump to smaller ecosystems and have enjoyed that journey. And I just feel that you can actually build a company from all of the fundamentals and all of the basics when you have a smaller scope of work to do rather than just these large, massive factories that have very much a very narrow but thin perspective on what a job should be, and they just want that thing to be done properly. And for me, I'm more of a generalist, so to be able to apply my experience and capabilities across multiple topic areas is very important. More recently, I was the CEO of LiveTiles, which was a enterprise SaaS intranet solution, and that was a publicly listed firm. There's a very different proposition to a private company. And then more recently, I started only 2 months ago now as CEO of Avolution Software, which is again enterprise SaaS, but enterprise architecture software. We can talk about that a bit later, but very different experiences from the big end of town, global business, highly scalable, all the way down to a much smaller, less than 100 employees in a much faster rate of growth.
Yeah, it's a cool background and obviously a lot of different experience from Microsoft to Salesforce to now your most recent companies. In terms of Microsoft, I want to get into some of the details there because it's quite interesting, your role there and the results that you were responsible for driving. So what was the quota that you were trying to lead at Microsoft, and how did your role, I guess, become a leader of that sales department from joining?
Yeah, so 16 years you have the opportunity to do multiple roles. And so I transitioned to what was called Enterprise Sales Excellence Lead based in Seattle. So I lived in Seattle for 7 years, which is head office. I really enjoyed the intellectual curiosity of being in a head office. And so as Enterprise Sales Excellence Leader, I looked after the sales operations or the sales processes of the enterprise business globally. And that was a big book of business in the day. And my quota on the last year I was in the role was $32 billion. And I actually had to sign that quota and guarantee I would bring in $32 billion or I wouldn't get my incentive. So it was a very, a big book of business. Now, there was a lot of people attached to that number. So it wasn't just me bringing in 32 billion. But what I did get to see was how to do enterprise sale at scale and probably one of the largest software companies in the world, and just how to actually operationalize a business like that. And for me, the things that I learned was, well, it's not rocket science. And that was the most important thing. A lot of rigor and discipline. Cadence matters, rhythm matters, and then constantly looking at talent and talent was a big part of that. So that was a tremendous experience and a great opportunity. I was able to get that role because I was really good at solution selling. And so I was a global head of financial services for Microsoft. And so when it came to doing big deals with the largest banks in the world, I was good at that and was able to orchestrate and connect and drive a lot of value for some of the most challenging enterprise sales environments. And so to actually then make the jump to, horizontal, not just a vertical domain was, I won't say easy, but it was more straightforward than going from a simple to a very complex domain. And I encourage people to also think about that in their careers as, when you make a domain jump, is actually what are you doing the jump for? And for me, it made a lot of sense. And so I became not just a financial services leader, but I became a software industry executive leader as a result of that change.
Yeah, wow. So in terms of working at Microsoft, what were some of the, I guess, principles that it taught you in terms of leading a team and also driving revenue growth, specifically around that quota?
Yeah, so I think the number one management lesson I've ever learned of is, do people know what success looks like? And it sounds really trite and it sounds like every other management book that you've ever read, but it really does matter. And that means, are you setting targets? Are you measuring to those targets? Are you checking in on those targets? Are you asking questions? Are you learning from that process? And so, at Microsoft, we had pretty much every subsidiary on a scorecard with 25 KPIs, and you had to deliver on those score. And we did MBUs and we did QBUs and we just did the rhythm. And you could start to see where people were not acting like a good custodian of the business. And that was the number one question. We would be sitting there in meetings and looking at people saying, are you a good custodian of this business? Now, that doesn't mean, are you a good people leader? Does that mean a good seller? Are you on top of the data? Do you understand the business? Do you understand the fundamentals? Do you understand your market? And can we trust you to actually deliver on that number? And that to me was just hugely insightful. And it had so many balancing components to it. It was not just a sales number, it was a strategic growth. So for example, if we needed to sell a new product, that may not bring in a lot of revenue, but you need to drive that product revenue. You need to drive that product penetration now, otherwise your competitors would come in. And there was always people-related metrics and all of that. So it was very straightforward. It's something that I've implemented in every scenario of my experience going forward. In fact, it's now 2 months for me in the role. I'm just launching the KPIs this week to the whole company. And so everybody now knows what success looks like for this calendar year, which is our fiscal. To me, it's a wonderfully empowering, organic, self-perpetuating machine to actually get that right. But still, you also need to make sure you've got the right people on board. And some people will, I would say, be overly optimistic. Some people will be overly pessimistic. And you're looking for the right mix of entrepreneurial as well as process, as well as detailed in every one of these journeys. And people selection was a huge part of it. So a big part of my day running enterprise sales excellence was actually participating in interviews. And so, being part of that leadership selection process was important. So I feel very fortunate. I've had, hundreds, if not thousands of interviewing, senior executives globally. And I think that skill is very, very important to learn. I think the last thing I would share with the team is, particularly, if you're in Australia, you need to have a global growth mindset. And a lot of people, especially entrepreneurs or even investors, really struggle with, how can this Australian firm actually compete on the world stage? Well, absolutely, we can compete on the world stage. Absolutely. And the number one thing that I remember quite vividly was every time we'd go to a country or a region, we'd do a review, they'd say, oh, well, David, it's different here. Well, it's not. And it rarely is different. And so if you design your business to be global first from day one, that is the best thing you possibly can do. Global systems, processes, standard titles, compensation plans, marketing approach, brand mechanisms. Really design it from, to be global at the outset, because it is not that different globally. And I saw it, from the other end, where people would really say, oh no, actually selling in Romania is different to selling in Canada. Well, actually the commonalities far outweigh, like 90%, 98% outweigh the differences. Don't let people get away with, saying it's different here, because it's not.
Yeah, that's a really good point there, David. I think a lot of people get trapped in thinking that they can't work on the global scale and can compete with the US because they're a little Australian company. But you're right, especially now we can do everything via Zoom and video calls. So in terms of hiring leaders, obviously you mentioned you've sat in thousands of interviews. What are some of the key things that you look for in leaders?
Well, the three things that I look for, number one is energy. And it's a very trite statement to say as well, but are they an energy giver or an energy taker? The second thing I would look for is integrity. And that comes about in just the way in which they will talk about their history or present themselves or answer a question. I'm only half smart, but I generally can tell when people are not telling the truth. And so it just doesn't make sense to me that people are do not have higher integrity in those moments. And I think the third thing is I'm looking for a sense of intellectual horsepower or insight into the business or market that's going to give me or the business an edge. And I think the number one the mistakes that you can make in this journey is, and I've made them, is number one, hiring people that you fall in love with. And I don't mean that in a romantic sense. I just mean that they seem to have a resume from heaven, and that you think, oh, I'll never get any better than that. And so you just buy into them without really doing your homework. And the second thing is doing reference checks. Probably the number one, hands down, most important thing. And we all know that bringing in from your network is so much more valuable than cold calling, but always do your reference checks. Always do. And I do them personally. So I've just, hired a CFO for Avolution. I rang and did the reference checking personally, because if a recruiter or your HR person does it, they'll just give a pretty bland answer. And I'm looking for that insight. And I think the third thing is you can tell pretty quickly whether they're in or out. And I mean that is in your judgment and your perception. But if they're wavering, is can they actually read the room and pick up on the signals and actually change the dynamic in the situation? Because it's a very human interaction, and it's a lot of emotions and a lot of feelings and a lot of tensions. That's why I prefer in person, because you get many more signals. And so are they smart enough to adapt in the moment? So I might throw a curveball, and just their ability to respond and adapt in a given situation is important. But I only get 8 out of 10 right, and I don't think anyone on the planet gets better than 8 out of 10 in hiring. So it's a very, very big expense if you get it wrong. It typically takes you 6 months to work out that something's wrong, and then 6 months to decide I'm going to change this person, and 6 months to actually find a replacement. So it's an 18-month decision, and it's probably even more for the more senior person, but it's usually 18-month tax you're going to pay if you get it wrong. So spend a lot of time on people selection and do the right thing, and don't be flippant, and make sure your team are holding themselves to account. I read all the reviews from all the other interview participants, and I can start to tell who's not interviewing correctly in that process, and I will take it up with them and just say what's going on. But it's again, none of this is rocket science, but it is a lot of rigor and discipline.
Totally. Amazing insights, David. So in terms of moving away from Microsoft and into Live Tiles, what caused that change, and what was that transition like, and what was your role there?
Yeah, well, one thing, particularly for careers for Australians, is generally you have to get out of Australia for your career to go really, really well. And, expats who live overseas, the Australian management culture, people culture, intellectual culture, communication culture is absolutely world class. And I highly encourage people to go and, get some experience overseas and just realise how good and applicable it is. You will always see Australians, at the top echelons of many global companies doing really well, and a lot of that has to do with the culture that we have here. The problem with that is getting back. And if getting back is important to you, and I'm a father of 4 daughters, I wanted them to go to high school in Australia. That was a high priority for my wife and I. Getting back is very hard. And so I always liken it to a whole bunch of 747s flying around Sydney Airport, trying to land, but there's no gate available. And so all of a sudden the gate becomes available, and in comes a plane and they grab that gate, but the others have got to keep circling until the spot becomes available. So after my 10 years away from the country, I was able to bring the family back and do a global role from Australia, and that worked out quite well. But after a period of time, my next gig had to be back in Seattle, and it was becoming very, very apparent. In fact, I was traveling every month to the US and back. All my direct reports were in the US, and it was starting to really become a challenge. And I was pretty much at the same level as the country manager in Australia, and I was like, well, do I, go back to Seattle? And so it became a career decision. But interesting at that time, I firmly became of the opinion that innovation happens at the edge. Innovation happens iteratively, and the enterprise is no longer a source of innovation. And I wanted to scale down at that point and focus on a more dynamic approach. I also wanted, again, back to my generalist point, I wanted the opportunity to do sales, marketing, product, finance, HR, all of the disciplines across, because I feel that I could be stimulated by that and get a lot of energy from that. So I went small scale at that point and was fortunate enough to find a great company to be able to exercise that.
Yeah, amazing, amazing. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And in terms of obviously live tiles, we obviously talked before the podcast about your experiences there, obviously leading the company to a successful exit. Are you able to share a little bit more about how you did that, some of the strategies that you used to drive growth and really lead that exit?
Yeah, it was, I won't say the smoothest of processes in any way, shape, or form, but it was probably the most amount of learnings I've had in a short period of time. It was just so dynamic, and also being publicly listed. Very, very different dynamic to being a private company. So that was all fascinating. But we just got to the point where we needed to start focusing significantly. The company had purchased a number of other companies. It had actually bought 6 companies over 6 years, and they bought 3 too many, in my opinion. So I actually had to sell off 3 of them and get rid of those off the books. They were not adding the value that was ever anticipated. And then we really needed to start focusing on customer retention, just the basics, product development, and doing sales properly. And all of this under the auspices of getting out of the public limelight and being private. And that move to going private was very, very important part of the process, because I would say, and I don't know who listens to the podcast, but being a small cap tech stock on the Australian Stock Exchange is not pleasant. It is, you're constantly looking for quarterly returns, and yet you have to invest for the long term. And so the dynamics are all wrong, if you ask me, and we have an immature investor base in Australia that can actually cope with that. So it's much better being private, having that access to capital, but also having a mindset of longer term. And that's why I'm so pleased with Avolution. On December the 5th, White Oak Capital purchased the company, and then I started on January the 6th. And so it's like perfect, because we now have the right shareholders effectively providing the right level of acceleration capital to be actually do the right things long term. Very, very, very different. But look, at the end of the day, it's setting expectations, and the expectations was we have to focus on profitability, not on growth. And I think there was a maniacal focus on growth at all costs for too long in the market, but also that was apparent in the other company as well. So just getting the focus in and making sure people were held accountable, and then we got through to a successful sale, which I was very pleased with.
Amazing. Yeah, amazing. So coming into your new role now as CEO at Avolution. So obviously, getting back to your CEO role where you're overseeing everything that happens within the company, right? Which it sounds like is your sweet spot where you really get energy from. What are your, I guess, main priorities right now when you've come into the new role and you're looking at, okay, how can we grow this company, whatever the objectives are? What are your first priorities when you joined the company or are at the moment?
A good question. Number one, in any of these scenarios, is the founder transition. It's the greatest risk that a company can take on, and it needs to be done very, very well. And I'm fortunate in this scenario that the founder transition is going extremely well, and I'm extremely happy with it, where they're able to allow me to run the company in the way in which I've been asked to do. But they can also feel confident enough to let go a little bit of the business. And so they are moving from a point where the world revolved around them and every day and every decision, and often they're a cash-based business, and it's like, I approve every expense. In fact, in this particular occasion, I think I've now got 27 accounts that I've got to move money through. So it's like letting go of a lot of controls and mechanisms, but it works really well when you've got alignment across, the board, the founder, and the new CEO. Very, very, very important. And a lot of that has to do with honesty and integrity. And, I'm very fortunate the founder of Avolution has got a lot of integrity and a lot of care for the business and just wants to see this business succeed. So he spends a lot of time making sure I'm successful. And that's not just him deciding what success looks like. It's asking me, how can I help you be more successful? And so I will ask him a question that probably would be well below his pay grade in terms of what he's capable of, but he's one of the few people that just understands and gives me an answer straight away. So he knows that, okay, well, you probably should go over to see Bob for that one, but here's the answer. So he helps me get up to speed very, very, very quickly, and it's a great partnership. The second thing is Understanding what made the company great, made the company good, made it investable, made it successful, made it profitable, and making sure that you know what you're tinkering with in the process. And so, in this particular case, the product is unassailable in the marketplace. It's still rated as the number one product by Gartner globally. So it's the product is amazing, and that's stemming from the founder's capability and intellect. And so making sure you're investing in the areas that made the company good. But then to my other point is just now starting to articulate what success looks like now, because you are trying to create a change, and you really want to do that in I won't say a standard change management process, because it's not standard. It's not like you're going from one ERP system to another. No, you're actually doing a big change right throughout the culture. And so you have to think about the messages that you're sending, the cadence of that messaging, your accessibility, your clarity. And so I'll give you an example. I was recently in the UK with the UK team, and we were talking about a topic, and I realized they didn't understand how private equity worked. And what role does the private equity firm have in our business? Because they used to only ever have to deal with the founder. So I just explained, private equity 101. And they were just like, oh, okay, I can relax now. And now I had no idea that was potentially an unknown or a blocking scenario. So, but to connect the point, I was smart enough in the moment to read the room to realize they're stuck on this point and unblocked. And then you need to keep the momentum and keep the engines rolling. You need to keep the product innovation engine going, the sales momentum going. It's all very, very important just to keep that rhythm going and keep the energy levels up. It's not I think there are some CEOs who consider the role a cheerleader role, and it's more than that, and it's really about making sure that people know the difference between good and bad and how that has to be aligned right throughout the organization, and you get a compounding effect with that alignment. And it's a very human problem, and you really have to want to engage emotionally in a human way, not only in a scientific way. I would consider myself much more on the science end of the spectrum, but I really have to engage in my human end of the spectrum.
Yeah, interesting. So in terms of driving revenue growth, what are some of the key sales strategies that you've used previously and are looking to use now at Avolution? Is there any key strategies that you see working repeatably, or what does that look like to you?
Well, I don't think there's anything new under the sun in terms of sales strategy and approach. It's really the powerful combination of what you consider to be unique. So the permutations and combinations of the strategy matter, and that's what's unique. It's not necessarily all the elements. And so in our scenario, number one is the product really, really, really matters. And you could say that in every scenario, but we will overfunction on making sure we maintain a leadership position on a product perspective, and we're actually going to triple R&D to keep that. In fact, in the marketplace right now, 7 of the top 8, by the way, we're in the top 8, but the other 7 are distracted with their own M&A that they've undertaken in the last 6 months, and so they're actually causing confusion amongst their customers right now. So my perspective is, if I sprint right now for 12 months and get that 12-month lead on the product, they will never catch up. So that would be sales strategy number one. I think sales strategy number two is there was a certain amount of accountability that needs to sit with field leaders, sellers, pre-sales teams, customer success teams, services teams, support teams. And I don't think the alignment was necessarily where it should be. And a lot of that has to do with we didn't have the instrumentation. So getting the instrumentation right is very, very important. For example, just renewing on time is really, really, really a disciplined, rigorous engine of a well-known process. Sure, you have to reach out to the customer and you ask them, are you going to renew? And, would you like some more product with that? And do you have any feedback for us? But that has to be done weekly, daily, monthly, whatever the cadence is, and that's a science, not an art. So there was a lot of alignment we needed to do across the sales organisation, and that's going to take some time. So we'll see that. But I've seen that movie before, and that will work. There's nothing rocket science in that one. And I think the third aspect is our product is quite technical. And therefore, some people have an allergic reaction to marketing because, well, why are you spending money in a marketing sense on a product that really is very well known specific buyer? But brand awareness is really, really, really important. And we're in a world of scarce resources when it comes to attention span. And so we are going to do a lot more in marketing. We will not do too much in marketing because there are people that ski over the tips of their skis. And I think there are examples even in our industry where people are jawboning people into a purchase as opposed to really the value proposition. So we won't do that, but we'll do more than what we're doing right now. There are many other facets to the business that we'll fix, but they would be the three big levers. And that combination of sales transformation will be different in each particular company. But if there's 20 to 30 variables in improving sales, you've got to pick a couple and overinvest and overfunction.
Yeah, totally. I love it. And so in terms of, looking over your career and obviously being around sales and growth, what have been some of the key lessons that you've learned and wish you knew when you were starting over early in your career?
I think the number one thing anybody can do is know how to learn. And that is a very personal statement. It's like you've just got to be really good at knowing how to learn because the world changes, particularly in technology. It's like changing all the time. In fact, Steve Ballmer, who I spent a lot of time with, used to say, if you ever wanted to be part of a stable, reliable and predictable business, you should never have joined the technology industry. So you have to learn really quickly. And you start to realize, I actually learn via instruction, or I learn via doing, or I learn via presenting to customers, or I learn via formal training. So work it out and get good at it because you're constantly learning. And it's been a high priority for me in my career to continue to learn. And I just think that's a really unique and sustainable competitive advantage in a person. So I started my career by, I was an engineer originally and never had any expectation to do any further education whatsoever. I had a great time at uni and I was going to move on. Now I've done 6 degrees and a PhD. So it's like really important to actually find out what really floats your boat in that journey. So learning how to learn, I think, is really important. The second thing I would tell myself is get really good at picking where growth comes from. And that doesn't mean you just wave surf. And, there's a lot of people on the AI wave right now, for example, or they were on the cloud wave, or they were on the mobile wave, or they were on the big data wave, or they're on the internet wave. And I've seen about 7 big technology shifts and it's just a wave. All of them are a wave and they all are durable and compound and, grow over time. So you're not looking for the next big wave, but you are looking for always rising tides or where there's unmet needs. And so there's ways in which people can extrapolate and say, if that happens and then if AI is occurring here and then this is going on in the enterprise or this is going on in the consumer, I reckon there's a gap. And so get really good at picking the gaps and finding where there's going to be a rising tide based on compounding inputs and don't just wave surf. It is very transparent. I think the third thing I would say is the truth is always in the field and always with the customer. And so no matter how much you trust your teams and you believe in them and you support them, stay relevant by being in front of the customer a lot. And so I recently came back from the UK and in 7 days had 14 customer and partner meetings. And I tell you what, I just get so much learning at a rapid pace of primary data, and to me it's just great. I now know if the product team says to me, David, we're going to stop doing this because customers don't want it, but I just heard it from 13 of the 14. It's like, okay, well, let me just ask a question of why that might be the case. And also it's testing you on delivering your value proposition over and over again. It's also communication skills are very, very important, and that's in written format, large presentation format, or conversational format. And so you have to get really good at presenting and conversing. So I would say, always be near the customer. It's definitely, in case of a downturn, it's always very safe to be close to the customer in a downturn, but I've seen enough of those. And, it's really where the truth is. And it is absolutely at the edge is where the truth. And last thing I would say is professional networking. And this is not just, going to events and having coffee and muffins. This is about, really professional networking where you're actually picking out people and say, can I pick your brain for this? I've got an idea and I want to know what you think. And building up enough of a network And some people call it mentoring, but it's more than that. It's you're picking out people for specific subject matter expertise and you're professionally joining the dots. And that to me is probably the number one personal development activity one can do, is make sure you've got a great network. And if you've started with a good one, there's more you can do. And just the ability to ring someone and say, I'm thinking of doing this, does that make sense? And they go, no, are you serious? Like, that technology's old, or, that's a bad idea. So you can save a lot of costs and a lot of personal heartache in that journey. But and you got to take it like a science. And so some people say, oh, but I'm no good at cold calling someone. It's all rubbish. It's like people really want to help and people understand what professional networking is, and you just need to be clear and say, you're someone.
Wait, that's been an amazing podcast. I've really enjoyed it today. If people want to get in touch with you, David, where can they find you? Amazing. Thanks for your time, David.